They served her the divorce papers on a Tuesday morning inside the boardroom she had quietly funded for 3 years. Linnea Hargrove Sutton, 37 years old, sat at the long maple table with her hands folded and her face still. Not the stillness of shock, the stillness of someone who had already grieved the thing that was being killed in front of her. She had grieved it months ago, in a hotel lobby in Ottawa, when she saw the way her husband looked at another woman, not with desire exactly, but with relief. The way a man looks at something uncomplicated. The boardroom was on the 14th floor of a building in downtown Toronto, the kind with floor-to-ceiling glass that made the whole city look like a painting you were not allowed to touch. Linnea had sat in this room dozens of times. She knew which chair squeaked, which window latch didn't close properly in winter, which corner of the ceiling had a water stain from a leak 3 years back that maintenance had painted over but never actually fixed. She knew this room better than anyone in it knew her. Her husband, Callum Sutton, 42, senior partner at Sutton Graves Development Group, sat across from her with his lawyer on his left and his mother on his right. Edwina Sutton, 68, a woman who had the kind of posture that made every room feel like an audition she was already winning. Edwina had not looked at Linnea when she walked in. She had looked at her watch instead, which was the most honest thing she'd done in years. The woman beside Callum's lawyer, not his mother, the other one, younger, in a charcoal blazer with the collar turned up slightly more than the room required, was named Tara. Linnea knew Tara. She had met her at a company dinner 18 months ago and spent 45 minutes talking to her about residential zoning challenges in Brampton before realizing that Tara was not listening to a single word. Tara had been watching Callum across the room with that same look, the relief look, the uncomplicated look. Callum had told Linnea about Tara 4 months later in the kitchen of their home in Rosedale, on a Sunday evening while the pasta water came to a boil. He'd said it gently, which was worse. He said he didn't mean for it to happen. He said he hadn't been happy for a long time. He said he thought, if he was being honest, that they'd grown into 2 different people who wanted 2 different lives, and wasn't it better to know that now than later? Linnea had turned off the burner. She had looked at him for a long moment. Then she had said, okay, not because she wasn't devastated. She was. She'd driven to her sister's house in Oakville that night and sat on the back deck until 2 in the morning with a blanket over her legs, not crying so much as just being very quiet while the whole shape of the life she'd built rearranged itself in her mind. But she said okay because she had learned, a long time before Callum, that falling apart in front of someone who has already decided to leave is the loneliest thing you can do. So she said okay. She hired her own lawyer. She began the process of untangling 9 years of a shared life. What she did not do, what she told no one, not her lawyer, not her sister, not the board she had quietly built around herself over the past 4 years, was mention the Whitmore Fund. The Whitmore Fund was a private investment vehicle registered in Ontario, named for a street in Halifax where Linnea had grown up and where her grandmother had owned a narrow blue house with a garden that smelled like thyme in summer. Linnea had established the fund 7 years ago, before she married Callum, when her consulting work had started generating serious income and she needed somewhere to put it that had nothing to do with anyone else's name. She had not hidden it from Callum out of deception. She had simply never found the right moment to explain something he had never asked about. Callum had a confident way of assuming he understood the scope of what surrounded him. He knew she consulted. He knew she did well. He did not know what well meant because he had never really asked, and she had learned not to volunteer information into conversations that weren't quite invitations. The Whitmore Fund had, over 7 years, become something substantial. It had invested in a mixed-use development in Hamilton, a heritage restoration project in Quebec City, 3 residential towers in Calgary, and, most recently, most quietly, a significant equity stake in the Meridian Heights project, a 42-story luxury development in downtown Toronto that was widely considered the most ambitious urban construction project in the city in over a decade. Meridian Heights was the flagship project of Sutton Graves Development Group, Callum's company, the project Callum had been building his entire legacy around. The project that had, 8 months ago, run into a financing gap large enough to threaten everything. A gap that had appeared quietly in the books, visible only to someone who understood project finance at a granular level, and that the board had been managing with increasing desperation, while keeping the news from the press and from their partners. The gap had appeared because their primary lender had revised their terms mid-cycle, because the contingency reserves Callum had always been too optimistic about had not materialized the way his projections promised. Linnea had seen it coming. She had seen it before Callum had, actually, because she had been reviewing the publicly available filings for a different reason entirely. She'd been doing due diligence on a neighboring development and pulled the Sutton Graves numbers almost by accident. What she found made her put down her coffee and sit very still for about 10 minutes. Then she had called her fund manager, a quiet man named Douglas, whom she trusted completely and who had the rare quality of doing exactly what he was asked without needing to understand why. "I want to acquire the available equity in Meridian Heights," she said, quietly through the fund. "Don't attach my name to any of the intermediate structures. You understand what this project's exposure looks like right now?" Douglas had said. "Yes," she said. "I understand it better than the people running it." He had paused. All right. She did not think of it at the time as anything other than a calculated investment. The project was fundamentally sound. The bones were excellent. The location was irreplaceable. The financing gap was a structural problem, not a vision problem, and structural problems had solutions if someone was willing to move decisively and without sentiment. She was willing. She also, somewhere beneath the calculation, knew that she was watching her husband's life's work slide toward a quiet catastrophe, and that she was the only person positioned to catch it. She did not examine that knowledge too closely. She was practical above all things, and practicality does not require you to name every feeling before you act. The deal closed in stages over 6 weeks. The Whitmore Fund became the majority equity partner in Meridian Heights. Sutton Graves retained operational control. The financing gap closed. The project resumed. The press release, carefully worded, described a new institutional investor without naming anyone. Callum had sent a company-wide email celebrating the new partnership. Linnea had been in Montreal that week for a different meeting and had read the email on her phone in a hotel restaurant while eating a bowl of French onion soup. That was 8 months ago. Now she was sitting in this boardroom with the divorce papers in front of her, and Callum's lawyer was explaining the terms of the proposed settlement in a tone that suggested he was accustomed to people simply signing. The settlement was not particularly generous. It acknowledged the years. It did not acknowledge much else. Edwina had undoubtedly had a hand in the structure of it. The number was specific in the way that suggested someone had done the calculation for how little they thought they could get away with offering. Linnea listened to the whole thing. Then she folded her hands on the table and said, "I'd like to table the settlement discussion for a moment." Callum's lawyer looked at her the way lawyers look at people who are about to make their jobs harder. Callum said, "Linnea, I have some questions about Meridian Heights," she said. The room changed slightly. It was not a dramatic change. No one stood up or raised their voice, but something shifted in the quality of the silence. The way a room shifts when a word is said that everyone has been trying not to say. Callum's lawyer said carefully, "This is a personal matter." "The project isn't. The project is relevant," Linnea said, "because I'd like to understand how the proposed settlement accounts for my position in the project." Callum said, "You don't have a position in the project." Linnea looked at him. It was the same look she had given him in the kitchen in Rosedale, the night he had told her about Tara. Quiet, steady, not unkind exactly, but not soft either. "The Whitmore Fund does," she said. The silence that followed was a different kind than before. Callum's mother, who had not looked at Linnea once in the 40 minutes since the meeting started, looked at her now. Callum said, "What?" Linnea opened the folder she had carried in and placed it on the table. The documents were clean and clearly organized, a habit of hers that she had maintained since university, when she had worked 2 part-jobs and could not afford the luxury of disorganization. She slid a single peg across the table toward Callum's lawyer, not toward Callum himself. A small choice, but deliberate. "The Whitmore Fund is the majority equity partner in Meridian Heights," she said, "has been for 8 months. The fund is wholly owned by me, which means that any settlement discussion about the division of assets should probably include a conversation about what that position is worth and what the terms of the partnership agreement say about transfer of equity in the event of a significant change in the personal circumstances of the principals." Callum's lawyer picked up the page. He read it. He put it down. He picked it up again. Callum said, "That's not possible. The registration is filed with the Ontario Securities Commission," Linnea said. "My lawyer has the full documentation, including the correspondence from 8 months ago when the Whitmore Fund stepped in to close the financing gap that would have collapsed the project by March." Callum stared at her. There are moments in a person's life when they understand, all at once, the full shape of something they have been standing too close to see. It is not a pleasant feeling. It is not unpleasant either, exactly. It is just very large. Callum was having one of those moments. Tara, beside his lawyer, had gone very still. Edwina, at the end of the table, set down her pen. "The financing gap," Callum said slowly. "The investor who came in last November. That was me," Leah said. "Yes, you didn't tell me. You didn't ask, she said. It was not an accusation. It was accurate. Callum leaned back. Something moved across his face that she couldn't quite name, and she had spent 9 years learning his face. Not quite shame, not quite grief. Something more like the particular vertigo of realizing you have misunderstood the dimensions of something for a very long time. Why? He said. Why would you do that, if you were already? Because it was a good investment, she said, and because the project was sound and deserved to be finished. She paused, and because some part of me, despite everything, did not want to watch you lose it. The room was quiet. Outside the windows, Toronto continued in its ordinary way. A construction crane moved slowly against a grey November sky. Somewhere below, the hum of the city did what it always did, which was continue regardless of what was happening in the rooms above it. Edwina said, from the end of the table, in a voice that was careful in the way expensive things are careful. What is it that you want, Linnea? It was the first time Edwina Sutton had said her name in this room. Possibly the first time she had said it in 2 years without a particular quality of impatience behind it. Linnea looked at her. A fair settlement, she said. One that accounts for my actual position, not the one your son assumed I had. My lawyer will be in touch with yours by end of week. She closed her folder. She stood. She picked up her coat from the back of her chair, a dark green wool coat she had owned for 6 years because she bought things that lasted, and she said, to no one in particular, and to all of them equally, I'll see myself out. She was at the door when Callum said her name. She stopped. She turned. He looked for the first time in a very long time like the man she had married. Not the one who had drifted and rationalized and chosen the easier thing. The one before all of that, who had stood in front of her at a fundraising dinner 11 years ago and said something genuinely funny about the canapés and made her laugh until her eyes watered. I didn't know, he said, about any of it. About what you. I know, she said. It was not forgiveness. It was not absence of hurt. It was something more precise than either of those, which was the simple acknowledgement that some gaps between people open so gradually that no one notices until they are standing on opposite edges, and by then the distance is not the problem. The distance is just what happened while you were both looking somewhere else. Take care of the project, she said. It deserves to be finished. Then she went. The settlement took 11 weeks. Linnea's lawyer, a careful woman named Bridget, whom she had worked with on 3 previous deals and trusted absolutely, structured the agreement to reflect the fund's equity position, the fair market valuation of her contributions, and the terms of the Meridian Heights partnership in a way that left no ambiguity and offered no room for the kind of quiet minimization that Callum's family had initially attempted. The final number was more than 3 times what Callum's original settlement had proposed. Edwina Sutton called her once during the negotiation period. It was a Thursday evening. Linnea was in her new apartment in the annex, smaller than the Rosedale house, quieter, with a kitchen window that looked out onto a courtyard where someone had planted a surprisingly resilient garden, and she was drinking tea and reviewing a proposal for a development in Kelowna. You made your point, Edwina said without preamble. I made a fair claim, Linnea said. A pause. You didn't have to do it the way you did in that room. Linnea considered this. I didn't choose the room, she said. Or the occasion, or the company. Another pause, longer. You were always more than Callum understood, Edwina said finally. And then, as though the sentence had cost her something real, she said nothing else and ended the call. Linnea sat with the phone in her hand for a moment. Then she put it down and went back to the Kelowna proposal because there was work to do and the light in the apartment at that hour was very good. And she had learnt long ago that the best thing to do after someone finally sees you clearly is simply to keep going. Meridian Heights was completed the following autumn. The topping out ceremony was covered in the Globe and Mail and in the Toronto Star and in 3 architecture publications that Linnea did not usually read but whose coverage Douglas forwarded to her with a brief characteristic note. Came out well. She did not attend the ceremony. She saw photographs of it later in a search she did not entirely mean to do on a quiet Sunday morning in October. Callum was in the photographs, in a hard hat, smiling the genuine smile she remembered. The building was beautiful. The glass on the upper floors caught the autumn light in a way that the renderings had only approximately suggested. It looked like something that would outlast the people who built it, which was, Linnea thought, closing the tab, exactly the point. She had a call at 11 about the Kelowna project, which had grown considerably since the initial proposal and was starting to look like something genuinely interesting. She made a second cup of tea. She sat down at the table by the window where the courtyard garden was doing its last autumn things before the cold came in. The thyme she had planted along the edge of the planters outside, a small, possibly sentimental choice, had survived the first frost. She had not expected it to, but it had. Some things, it turns out, are harder to uproot than anyone accounted for.